Well, tonight we're focusing on Ukraine and Europe's ongoing support for Kyiv as it fends off a Russian invasion. Earlier today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Belgium as part of a diplomatic European tour designed to drum up renewed military support from allies. He is crisscrossing the continent as Russia continues its advance on the Kharkiv region. Now, during his visit to Brussels, President Zelensky locked in a commitment from Belgium to supply 30 F-16 fighter jets by 2028. Meanwhile, there are reports that military instructors from France could soon arrive in Ukraine. That word came from Kyiv's army chief, and it was quickly walked back by the French government. The defense ministry only confirming that the issue was being studied. Siobhan Silk has the details.
Around 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers have received training in EU countries. But as yet, no ally has sent instructors to Ukraine to conduct drills on the recruits' home soil. On Tuesday, EU Foreign Chief Josep Borrell said member states were split on the prospect. France's government was the first to suggest it might send boots on the ground. On the Telegram messaging app on Monday, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces announced that France was indeed preparing to send military instructors to Ukraine. Alexander Sirski said he'd already signed the documents that would allow the first French instructors to visit Ukrainian training centres and get acquainted with their infrastructure and personnel. But the French Defence Ministry later declined to confirm a deployment was imminent, saying only that it was being studied. Ukraine then backtracked, stating the deployment of trainers was still being discussed with France and other countries. The confusion comes as Ukrainian forces have been struggling to cope with renewed Russian pressure on the front line. On his EU visit this week, President Volodymyr Zelensky has got new pledges for military aid. But while hardware is one thing, manpower is another. Ukraine's counter-offensive continues to be hampered by a severe shortage of trained soldiers.
And all of this brings us to the question of reintroducing mandatory military service in Europe. With the war still raging in Ukraine, some EU members, namely Italy and Germany, are floating the idea of requiring young people to report for military service. Now, 9 members of the bloc already require some form of military service, including Austria and Denmark. But for the vast majority of EU members, such a requirement was done away with decades ago. For example, here in France, the government suspended the requirement back in 2001. Well, now, though, in Italy, Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini's League Party has submitted a bill to the Chamber of Deputies proposing a mandatory 6-month period of military civilian service for all young people between the ages of 18 and 26. And Germany's main opposition party, the CDU, has put a gradual return to mandatory military service back on its agenda. For more on this, I'm joined by Tony Ingesson, an assistant professor in political science at Lund University. Thanks so much for being with us here on France 24. Now, you recently wrote an article in The Conversation about this issue. So why are we seeing a desire on the part of some EU members, specifically in the case of Italy and Germany, to return to the days where young people are required to serve in the military for a period of time? Why is this happening now?
Well, there are 2 main reasons, I would say. One is simply military manpower requirements. It has been quite difficult for a lot of European countries to fulfill their manpower requirements through voluntary recruitment. So conscription could be one way of solving that problem. And the second is that sometimes conscription is also advocated for more political reasons as a way of fostering national sensibilities and making youth grow up faster and take more responsibility, that kind of thing.
Do you think we're going to see an increase in this kind of trend with other EU countries requiring some kind of military training or service?
It is possible. There is already a kind of a trend going on in the sense that Sweden suspended conscription but for a few years, but then reinstated it. But of course, Sweden has a long tradition of conscription, so it was not as challenging to reinstate it. It would be significantly more challenging to reinstate conscription in a country like Germany or Italy, where it hasn't been used for quite some time. So it remains to be seen if they're willing to make that kind of commitment and that kind of investment that it would require to make these kind of drastic changes.
Does this boil down to a fear that Vladimir Putin won't stop with invading Ukraine, that he will make some kind of move to encroach on a NATO member? And how does NATO fit into this conversation?
I think that is a distinct possibility that many countries are considering at this point, that they feel probably in many cases that they don't have enough manpower to adequately serve their security needs. And in that case, conscription is a model that they have in many cases used for a long time, even if it's been some time since the end of the Cold War. So I think that definitely is part of the equation, trying to meet the new requirements of a deteriorating security situation in Europe.
So 9 EU members have some kind of requirement, whether that means reporting for service and having a medical exam or actually serving. But Sweden is the only EU member with military conscription for both men and women. Why do you think that is? And do you think that that might change for other countries?
I think it's quite possible that other countries will follow suit. In the case of Sweden, I'd say that the explanation is that we suspended conscription in Sweden, and then when we reintroduced it, it was considered a natural step to also extend it to women, since we were in the process of changing it in the sense of reintroducing it. And I think it's worked quite well here, and there is fairly broad popular support for conscription here, as it has always been. So I think that as other countries consider reintroducing conscription, they will probably also need to consider if they want to have women as well to be part of it.
How does the public perception of this issue of mandatory military service, how does this factor in, and how is that playing into the conversation? You know, for example, in Austria, there was a public referendum that upheld conscription by a pretty wide margin. Also, polls show that people in Sweden and Finland are also widely in favor of it.
I think there are fairly considerable national differences to take into account here. So countries with a tradition of conscription, where conscription has also been working well, because that, of course, that's not guaranteed. But if it works well and there's a long tradition of having it, then you can have a fairly high degree of legitimacy and a fairly high degree of popular support. But in other countries where it's been some time since conscription was used, or where it's been associated with other things that are less positive, I think it's going to be more difficult to get the kind of popular support you need to implement something like that. So I think some countries have some ways to go here before it'll achieve the kind of level of support that you can see in Sweden and Finland, for example.
Well, so in Austria, military service is compulsory for all male citizens for about 8 months. But if you're a conscientious objector, you can instead do 13 months of community service. When it comes to Germany and Italy, for example, do you see there being some kind of allowance for young people who have moral objections to serving in the military?
I think community service is a good solution, and that is something that we have had in Sweden as well, and which we are also reintroducing, because if it's something we can see in Ukraine, it is that there's going to be, in a case of war, it's going to be widespread devastation of societies, and there's going to be a lot of firemen needed, construction workers, repairmen, that kind of thing. So a lot of extra people are going to be needed, and conscription could serve that kind of needs as well. And that would also provide for people who are not willing to take up arms to be able to contribute in another way.
In your article, you sort of touch on the political aspect of this. You make a point about how Russia has recruited what you called a disposable infantry, using the private group Wagner and enlisting prisoners to fight in Ukraine. Can you explain what political reason Russia has for doing this?
I think that in Russia, they are somewhat reluctant to mobilize people from the middle class, people from urban settings, because that is something that could breed discontent and undermine what they probably consider to be some degree of popular support for the war. So instead, they recruit people from prisons, from minorities and such, and then they use them in a rather callous manner, I would say. So they have two different categories, simply speaking. So they have the disposable kind of infantry that takes all the risks and suffer very heavy casualties, and they tend to be prisoners and such. And then they can use more valuable kind of infantry, more regular infantry, to after that, once the first shock has been absorbed by this disposable infantry. And I think that's not new from a Russian point of view. It's in line with their traditional way of using people, but it's not something that any Western country, I think, would consider.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Tony Ingesson, an assistant professor in political science at Lund University. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's it for now. Stay tuned.